Hello everyone, I'm Mr. Edison, and I'm here to guide you into a peaceful slumber. If you find this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. I'd love to know where you're from and what time it is as you unwind. So settle in, get cozy, and let the relaxation begin. Some of my fondest memories as a child are my mother taking me to Girl Scouts. It's funny how certain things stick out over others. I don't remember the cookies, but I remember my mom meticulously sewing the badges on my uniform, her fingers working with precision despite her arthritis. I'm not sure if specific things persist in my memories more than others because I lost my mother when I was 14, and these were the primary activities we shared, or if it was simply my passion and eagerness for learning as a young girl. Either way, the Girl Scouts has always been a foundational part of my life. The organization became my sanctuary after Mom passed. While other teenagers found solace in rebellion, I immersed myself deeper into structured activities. The troop leaders became surrogate mothers, guiding me through the wilderness of adolescence with the same methodical approach they used to teach us how to navigate actual wilderness. By 16, I was helping with the younger troops, and by 18, I became an official volunteer. Into adulthood, I have remained a consistent volunteer, even though at 32, I haven't yet been blessed with children of my own to share these experiences with. There's something rejuvenating about watching young girls discover their capabilities, seeing their eyes widen with accomplishment when they successfully build their first fire or identify a poisonous plant. It reminds me of myself at their age, and somehow, it keeps my mother's memory alive. When people ask why I devote so much time to Girl Scouts, I tell them about the skills it teaches young women: independence, resourcefulness, teamwork. What I don't tell them is about what happened in the Greenvale Forest in 2017. I don't tell them about the incident that left me questioning everything I thought I knew about the natural world. I don't tell them about the girls who spoke of the man in the red cave. I've never put this story down on paper before. Please bear with me as I do my best to recount it accurately. Some details remain vivid, burned into my memory like a brand, while others have become hazy with time and, perhaps, with my mind's attempt to protect itself. It was supposed to be a standard camping trip, 3 days in Greenvale Forest with Troop 437, consisting of 12 girls aged 9 to 11. I was 24 at the time, one of 4 adult volunteers alongside the troop leader, Rebecca, and 2 mothers. My responsibilities included meal preparation and organizing arts and crafts, activities for the girls who weren't comfortable with the more physically demanding aspects of camping. The first day proceeded according to plan. We arrived at noon, set up camp, and spent the afternoon establishing ground rules and boundaries. The Forest Service had marked clear trails, and we emphasized the importance of staying on them. After a dinner of foil packet meals cooked over the campfire, we told mild spooky stories, nothing too frightening for the younger girls, and were in our tents by 9. The following morning dawned clear and cool, perfect hiking weather. After breakfast, Rebecca led us on what was supposed to be a 2-hour nature hike along the beginner's trail. The girls marched in pairs, chattering excitedly about spotting wildlife and collecting interesting leaves for their nature journals. I brought up the rear, keeping count of heads and occasionally reminding stragglers to keep up. Approximately 45 minutes into the hike, something strange happened. I was watching a red-tailed hawk circling overhead when a sudden pressure built in my ears. The forest sounds, the girls' voices, the rustling leaves, the distant woodpecker, all became muffled as though I'd descended underwater. A persistent buzzing filled my head, drowning out everything else. I blinked rapidly, disoriented, pressing my palms against my temples. When the sensation subsided seconds later, I instinctively counted heads. 11. I counted again. Still 11. One was missing. I quickened my pace, moving alongside the line of girls, taking mental attendance. It was Cindy who was missing, a quiet 10-year-old with dark braids who had been reluctant to come on the trip in the first place. I called her name softly at first, not wanting to alarm the others. When there was no response, I approached Rebecca at the front of the line. "Cindy's missing," I whispered, my voice tight with the beginning threads of panic. Rebecca's expression shifted immediately from relaxed to alert. She instructed the other adults to keep the girls in place while we backtracked. We called Cindy's name, our voices growing increasingly urgent as minutes passed without response. The forest seemed to absorb our calls, the thick canopy muffling our voices. 5 minutes stretched into 10. 10 into 15. Rebecca pulled out the emergency protocols, her hands trembling slightly as she prepared to contact forest rangers. My mouth had gone dry, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped animal. I couldn't stop thinking about the statistics I'd read about missing children, how the first 3 hours are crucial, how the chances of finding them diminish with each passing minute. Just as Rebecca was dialing, one of the mothers shouted. There, approximately 30 feet off the trail, was Cindy, walking through a patch of sunlight between the trees. She wasn't running or appearing distressed, just wandering, her head tilted as though listening to something. I sprinted toward her, calling her name. She turned, and I was struck by her expression. Not frightened or confused, but oddly serene, almost dreamlike. When I reached her, I dropped to my knees, gripping her shoulders perhaps too tightly as I examined her for injuries. "Cindy, are you okay? What happened? Why did you leave the trail?" The questions tumbled out of me, relief making my voice crack. She blinked at me, that strange smile still playing on her lips. "I'm fine," she said, her voice light and unconcerned. I was talking to my new friend. Friend? What friend? There's no one here, Cindy. I looked around, scanning the surrounding trees. "They're gone now," she said, still smiling. But they told me something important. They warned me about the man in the red cave. A cold sensation spread across the back of my neck. What man? What red cave? But Cindy just shrugged, taking my hand as though nothing unusual had occurred. As we walked back to the group, she began humming a tune I didn't recognize, swinging our joined hands. For the remainder of the hike, Cindy stayed unusually close to me, occasionally whispering comments about her friend and repeatedly mentioning the warning about the man in the red cave. Each time she said it, the hairs on my arms stood on end. I tried to dismiss it as the product of an overactive imagination. Perhaps she'd fallen asleep during our ghost stories and had a vivid dream. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted in the forest around us, like reality had briefly thinned, allowing something else to seep through. That night, I lay awake in my sleeping bag, listening to the gentle breathing of the girls and the occasional hoot of an owl. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Cindy's unsettling smile and heard her words about the man in the red cave. The logical part of my brain offered rational explanations. She'd become momentarily disoriented, wandered off, and invented a story to avoid getting in trouble. Children do this all the time. But another part of me, a primitive part that responds to shadows and unexplained sounds, wouldn't accept this explanation. Cindy had changed after her brief disappearance. The normally reserved girl had become talkative, almost manic. And there was something in her eyes that hadn't been there before, a knowing look that seemed out of place on a child's face. I must have fallen asleep eventually because I awoke to Rebecca shaking my shoulder. It was morning and the campsite was already bustling with activity. I helped prepare breakfast, moving mechanically through the familiar routines while keeping one eye on Cindy. She seemed normal again, quiet and slightly withdrawn, playing with her food rather than eating it. When I had a moment alone with her, I gently asked about what had happened the previous day. She looked at me blankly. "What do you mean?" she asked, genuinely confused. "You wandered off during the hike yesterday," I reminded her. "You said someone warned you about a man in a red cave." Cindy frowned, shaking her head. "I don't remember that," she said, and her confusion seemed authentic. I didn't push it. The remainder of the camping trip proceeded without incident, and by Sunday afternoon, we were packing up to return home. As we loaded the last of the gear into the vans, I found myself scanning the tree line, half expecting to see someone watching us. But there was nothing, just the wind stirring the leaves and the distant call of birds. For weeks afterward, I found myself thinking about the incident. I researched the Greenvale Forest area, looking for any references to a red cave or any historical incidents that might explain Cindy's warning. I found nothing conclusive, just vague mentions in local forums about hikers occasionally feeling watched in certain areas of the forest. One post mentioned a geological formation with iron-rich soil that gave the surrounding rock a reddish tint, but it was miles from our campsite. As months passed, the memory began to fade. I reasoned that Cindy had simply experienced a brief episode of confusion, perhaps triggered by dehydration or low blood sugar. I continued my volunteer work with the Girl Scouts, leading other camping trips to different locations without incident. But I never suggested returning to Greenvale Forest. And whenever I found myself in wooded areas, I couldn't help scanning the tree line, looking for movement that didn't belong, straining to hear voices that shouldn't be there. 5 years passed. I changed jobs, moved to a different part of the city, dated unsuccessfully, and continued volunteering. The incident with Cindy became a strange anecdote I occasionally considered sharing at campfires before thinking better of it. Until 2022, when circumstances brought me back to Greenvale Forest. The decision to return to Greenvale wasn't mine. The troop had a new leader, Valerie, who had selected the location based on its facilities and proximity to the city. When I saw the itinerary, my stomach tightened instinctively, but I couldn't articulate a logical reason to change venues. What would I say? 5 years ago, a girl wandered off and came back talking about a man in a red cave. It sounded ridiculous even to me. So I found myself loading camping gear into vans on a Friday afternoon in June, trying to ignore the apprehension building in my chest. It's just a forest, I told myself. One of the most popular camping spots in the state. Thousands of people visit annually without incident. Yet as we drove through the entrance gates, the tall pines looming on either side of the dirt road, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest recognized me, that it had been waiting for my return. We were assigned a different campsite than before, but the general area was the same. As we set up tents and organized supplies, I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, scanning the trees for... What? I didn't know. When one of the girls asked why I seemed nervous, I forced a smile and blamed it on forgetting to pack enough socks. That first day passed uneventfully. We hiked a different trail than the one where Cindy had disappeared, ate dinner, and gathered around the campfire for stories and songs. I began to relax, thinking perhaps my anxiety was unfounded. The forest was just a forest, ancient and indifferent to our presence. As night fell and the girls retired to their tents, I volunteered for the first watch. It was standard practice to have at least one adult awake at all times during overnight trips. I sat by the dying embers of the fire, a thermos of coffee beside me, listening to the night sounds of the forest. The moon was nearly full, casting silvery light through the gaps in the canopy and creating pools of brightness on the forest floor. In the distance, an owl called, its voice carrying clearly in the still air. I checked my watch, 11:42 p.m. My shift would end at 2 a.m. when Valerie would take over. I must have dozed off because I jerked awake suddenly, disoriented. The fire had died completely and the temperature had dropped. I checked my watch, 1:17 a.m. Something had woken me, but I wasn't sure what. Then I heard it, the soft crunch of footsteps on pine needles. I turned, expecting to see Valerie coming to relieve me early, but instead saw a small figure moving between the tents. One of the girls was awake and walking around the campsite. I recognized her as Isabel, an 8-year-old on her first overnight trip. Isabel, I called softly, not wanting to wake the others. What are you doing up? She turned toward me, and in the moonlight, I could see her expression was vacant, her eyes unfocused as though sleepwalking. I approached her carefully, knowing it could be dangerous to startle a sleepwalker. Isabel, honey, you should be in bed, I said gently, reaching for her hand. She looked at me then, and her eyes suddenly focused. I can't sleep, she said, her voice small but clear. Are you not feeling well? I asked, kneeling to her level. I keep having bad dreams, she replied, rubbing her eyes. My friend keeps waking me up. A cold weight settled in my stomach. Your friend? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Do you mean one of the other girls? She shook her head. No, my new friend. The one who whispers when everyone's asleep. My throat constricted. What does your friend whisper about, Isabel? They say I need to go see the man in the red cave. The words hit me like a physical blow. For a moment I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The exact phrase Cindy had used 5 years earlier, spoken by a different child who hadn't even been present during the first incident. Who is this friend, Isabel? I managed to ask, my voice barely audible. She frowned, struggling to articulate something beyond her vocabulary. They're everywhere, she finally said. In the trees, in the ground. They talk when no one's listening. I took her hand, which felt cold despite the mild night. "Let's get you back to bed," I said, guiding her toward her tent. "And if your friend tries to wake you again, you tell them you need to sleep." Once Isabel was settled back in her sleeping bag, I returned to my post by the dead fire, fully alert now. The forest around us suddenly seemed alive with malevolent intent, the darkness between the trees deeper than it should have been. I imagined countless unseen presences watching from the shadows, waiting for us to lower our guard. I didn't sleep again that night, not even after Valerie relieved me. I lay in my tent, eyes wide open, listening for whispers, for movement, for anything that might confirm the growing suspicion that something in this forest was targeting our girls. By morning, I had convinced myself that Isabel had simply overheard someone talking about the Cindy incident from years ago. Perhaps one of the older volunteers had mentioned it, and Isabel's dream had incorporated the detail. It was the only rational explanation. But I knew, with a certainty that defied reason, that I would never return to Greenvale Forest after this trip, and I would do everything in my power to ensure that no Girl Scout troop ever camped here again. The second day of the camping trip unfolded with forced normalcy. I went through the motions of helping with breakfast, organizing activities, and maintaining a cheerful demeanor for the girls. Inside, however, my mind was racing, connecting dots between Cindy's experience 5 years ago and Isabel's disturbing comments the night before. During a nature identification exercise, I pulled Valerie aside. "Have you noticed anything strange about Isabel today?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Valerie frowned. "Now that you mention it, she's been unusually quiet." "Is something wrong?" I hesitated, not wanting to sound paranoid. "She was sleepwalking last night. Mentioned having bad dreams. First time away from home," Valerie said with a shrug. "It happens. We'll keep an eye on her." I wanted to tell her more, about Cindy, about the man in the red cave, but the words died in my throat. Without context, it would sound like I was overreacting to a child's nightmare. Instead, I nodded and returned to the group, positioning myself near Isabel. The girl seemed normal during daylight hours, participating in activities and eating meals, though with less enthusiasm than the day before. Occasionally, I caught her staring into the forest, her head tilted slightly as though listening. Each time I approached her, breaking her concentration, and she would smile at me with no indication that anything was amiss. That evening, as we prepared dinner, I overheard 2 of the older girls talking in hushed tones. "Did you hear it last night?" one asked. "Hear what?" replied the other. "The whispering. It sounded like it was coming from right outside the tent. Probably just the wind." It wasn't the wind. It was saying words. I couldn't understand them, but they were definitely words. I interrupted, perhaps too abruptly. "What's this about whispering?" The girls looked startled. The first one, Julia, shrugged uncomfortably. "It's nothing. Just thought I heard something last night." "What kind of something?" I pressed. "Like whispering. Probably just the trees or something." I nodded, not wanting to alarm them, but inwardly my concern deepened. First Cindy, then Isabel, now Julia. 3 separate individuals experiencing similar phenomena in the same location. This couldn't be coincidence. That night, I volunteered for the midnight to dawn watch shift, determined to stay alert for any unusual activity. Armed with a powerful flashlight and a thermos of strong coffee, I positioned myself where I could observe all the tents while maintaining a view of the surrounding forest. The night was overcast, the moon only occasionally breaking through the cloud cover. The resulting alternation between deep shadow and silvery illumination created a disorienting effect, the forest seeming to shift and move with each change in lighting. The usual night sounds, rustling leaves, distant animal calls, the soft hooting of owls, took on an ominous quality in the intermittent darkness. Around 2:30 a.m., I heard it, a sound so faint I might have missed it if I hadn't been listening intently. A whispering, not from any particular direction, but seeming to emanate from the forest itself. It wasn't the wind. The air was still, and it had a cadence, a rhythm that suggested language rather than natural sound. I stood, sweeping my flashlight beam in a slow arc around the perimeter of our campsite. The light caught nothing unusual, just trees, underbrush, the ordinary features of a forest at night. Yet the whispering continued, now seeming to come from behind me. I turned quickly, but again saw nothing. The sound was maddening, clearly audible, yet impossible to locate. I began to doubt my senses, wondering if lack of sleep was causing auditory hallucinations. But then I noticed movement near one of the tents. The entrance flap was opening. Isabel emerged, her movements fluid and purposeful, unlike the shuffling gait of a sleepwalker. She was fully dressed, including her hiking boots, and carried her small backpack. Without hesitation, she began walking toward the forest edge, away from the marked trails. I called her name softly, not wanting to wake the entire camp. She didn't respond or acknowledge me in any way. I hurried after her, reaching her just as she was about to step beyond the clearing into the dense underbrush. "Isabel," I said firmly, grasping her shoulder. "Where are you going?" She turned to me, and in the beam of my flashlight, I could see that her eyes were wide open but vacant, as though she were looking at something far beyond me. "I have to go," she said, her voice flat and emotionless. "They're waiting." "Who's waiting, Isabel?" I asked, maintaining my grip on her shoulder. "The friends. They need to show me the Red Cave. They say it's important." My heart seemed to stutter. "You can't go into the forest at night, Isabel. It's dangerous." For the first time, emotion crossed her face, frustration bordering on anger. "But I have to. They said I'm the only one who can stop him." "Stop who?" "The man in the Red Cave." She spoke as though explaining something obvious to someone very slow. "He's doing bad things. They need me to see." I knelt before her, gripping both her shoulders now, forcing her to look directly at me. "Isabel, listen to me. These friends, can you describe them?" "What do they look like?" She frowned, considering. "They don't look like anything. They're just voices. They come from the trees, from the ground. They say they've been here forever watching." "And what do they say about this man?" Her expression darkened. "That he hurts people, that he's been hurting people for a long time, and that he'll hurt more unless someone stops him." A chill pervaded me despite the mild night air. "Isabel, I need you to go back to your tent now. These friends, they're not real." "They're just dreams." "They are real," she insisted, a sudden intensity in her voice. "And they've been trying to tell people for years, but no one listens." Her eyes focused on mine with unnerving clarity. "They told me about you. They said you heard them before, but you didn't listen either." I stared at her, speechless. The implication that whatever was communicating with Isabel knew about my previous experience with Cindy was too disturbing to process. Before I could formulate a response, Valerie emerged from her tent, rubbing her eyes. "Everything okay?" she called softly. "I thought I heard voices." I quickly composed myself. Isabel was sleepwalking again. "I'm just taking her back to her tent." Valerie nodded, too groggy to question further, and retreated to her tent. I guided Isabel back to her sleeping bag, ensuring she was settled before returning to my post. For the remainder of the night, I heard no more whispering, but the silence felt expectant, as though the forest were holding its breath, waiting. As dawn broke, I made a decision. We needed to leave Greenvale today, not tomorrow as planned. I just needed a plausible reason that wouldn't cause panic or make me sound unhinged. After breakfast, I approached Valerie with fabricated concerns about an incoming storm system. I had checked the weather forecast on my phone, straining for signal at the highest point of the campsite, and claimed that severe thunderstorms were predicted for the evening. It wasn't entirely untrue. There was a 30% chance of rain, but I exaggerated the severity considerably. Valerie was reluctant at first. "The girls will be so disappointed if we cut the trip short." "Better disappointed than endangered," I countered. "Some of these trees are over 100 feet tall. Not somewhere you want to be during a lightning storm." Eventually, she conceded, and we announced to the girls that we would be packing up after lunch. There were groans of protest, but the prospect of a thunderstorm dampened arguments. As we began breaking down the campsite, I kept Isabel close to me, volunteering her to help with my tasks. "Isabel," I said casually as we folded a tent, "those friends you mentioned last night, have they spoken to you before this trip?" She shook her head. "Only since we came to the forest." "And have they told you where this Red Cave is?" She nodded, pointing toward the densest part of the forest, away from any marked trails. "That way. They say it's not far, but it's hidden. People walk right past it all the time." I swallowed hard. "Have they told you anything else about the man? Like who he is or what he's done?" Isabel's expression became troubled. They say he's been here a long time. That he takes people. She lowered her voice to a whisper. They say there are bodies in the cave. Lots of bodies. A wave of nausea swept through me. If this were just a child's imagination, it was remarkably dark for an 8-year-old. And if it wasn't imagination, if there was some truth to what these voices were communicating, then we were dealing with something far more sinister than forest spirits. Isabel, this is very important, I said, keeping my voice steady. Have these friends asked you to go to the cave alone? She nodded solemnly. They said I need to see for myself. That grown-ups won't believe without proof. And what were you supposed to do once you found the cave? Look inside. See the evidence. Then tell someone who would listen. I felt cold despite the warming day. Promise me something, Isabel. Promise you won't try to find this cave, or listen if these friends call to you again.
It could be dangerous. She studied me with surprising intensity for a child her age.
You're afraid, she stated. Yes, I admitted. I am. The friends said you would be. They said that's why you didn't listen last time. I had no response to that. We continued packing in silence, and by mid-afternoon we were loading the vans, preparing to leave Greenvale behind. As I helped secure the last of the gear, I noticed Isabel standing at the edge of the parking area, staring into the forest, her head tilted in that now familiar listening pose. I hurried over to her. Isabel, time to go. She didn't move. They're saying goodbye, she said. And they're saying thank you. For what? She turned to me, her expression solemn. For believing this time. Before I could respond, Valerie called for final head count. I guided Isabel to the van, helping her buckle in. As we drove away from Greenvale Forest, I watched through the rear window as the trees receded, a deep sense of unease lingering even as the distance between us and the forest grew. That night, after ensuring all the girls had been safely returned to their families, I sat at my computer, hesitating only briefly before typing Greenvale Forest missing persons into the search bar. The results were unsettling. Over the past 50 years, 7 people had gone missing in or near Greenvale. Most were hikers who had ventured off trail, and investigations concluded they had likely become disoriented and succumbed to exposure or injury. But bodies had never been recovered. In each case, extensive searches had yielded nothing. No equipment, no clothing, no remains. It was as though the missing had simply vanished into the forest. 2 cases involved children, a 13-year-old boy in 1983 and a 9-year-old girl in 1997. Both had been camping with families when they disappeared from their campsites overnight. In the girl's case, search dogs had followed her scent to a specific area of the forest before losing the trail completely. The location was approximately half a mile from where our troop had been camping. I deepened my research, looking into local history and geological surveys of the area. Greenvale's documented history went back to the 1800s, when it was part of logging operations. Before that, it had been within the territory of indigenous peoples, namely the Abenaki tribe. One scholarly article mentioned Abenaki legends about certain forests containing thin places, locations where the boundary between the physical world and the spirit world was less defined. These places were considered neither good nor evil inherently, but dangerous to the unwary. The article specifically mentioned Greenvale Forest as a location that featured in such legends. Most unsettling was a small news item from 2001 buried in local archives. A hiker had reported finding what appeared to be a small cave entrance in Greenvale, partially obscured by vegetation. The interior walls had a distinctive reddish tint due to iron oxide deposits. According to the report, the hiker had observed what looked like scratch marks on the inner walls, but had not ventured far inside due to the narrow entrance. When forest rangers investigated, they couldn't locate the cave based on the hiker's directions. I sat back, processing this information. A red cave that officially didn't exist, multiple disappearances over decades, indigenous legends about thin places, and now 2 separate children, 5 years apart, hearing voices warning them about the man in the red cave. My rational mind insisted there must be a logical explanation. Perhaps Isabel had overheard someone talking about Greenvale's history or previous disappearances. Maybe there was a local urban legend about a red cave that had permeated camping culture, passing from child to child like a game of telephone. But another part of me, the part that had felt the forest watching, that had heard the whispering, believed that something genuine and inexplicable was occurring in Greenvale, that the forest itself or something within it was trying to communicate. And if that was true, what was I supposed to do about it? I slept poorly that night, my dreams filled with whispering trees and hidden caves. I woke before dawn, my mind made up. I couldn't ignore this, couldn't dismiss it as imagination or coincidence. There were too many connections, too many similar elements across separate incidents. If something was happening in Greenvale Forest, something that had resulted in disappearances spanning decades, I had a responsibility to investigate. Not alone and not without precautions, but I couldn't simply walk away. I called in sick to work and contacted a former Girl Scout from my early days as a volunteer, Joanna, now a police officer with the county sheriff's department. We had maintained a casual friendship over the years, meeting occasionally for coffee. I asked if she could meet me that morning, saying I needed her professional perspective on something sensitive. We met at a quiet cafe downtown. After some initial small talk, I laid out everything: Cindy's disappearance and strange behavior in 2017, Isabel's similar experience 5 days ago, the historical disappearances in Greenvale, and the mentions of a red cave that officially didn't exist. Joanna listened without interruption, her expression growing increasingly serious. When I finished, she sat back, tapping her fingers thoughtfully on the table. "First," she said, "I appreciate you bringing this to me rather than trying to investigate on your own. That would be dangerous regardless of whether there's something supernatural going on or something more conventional." "Conventional?" I echoed. "Think about it," she said, leaning forward. "If we set aside the voices from the forest aspect, what are we left with? Possible evidence of a location where multiple people have disappeared over decades, a hidden cave that might contain human remains, and 2 children who, for whatever reason, received some kind of warning about a dangerous man associated with this cave. Put that way, it sounded less like a supernatural mystery and more like a potential crime scene. You think there could be a real person behind this? What? A serial killer using Greenvale as a hunting ground?" Joanna shrugged. "It's one possibility. Remote areas with transient populations, hikers, campers, have historically been attractive to predators. The Green River Killer operated in wilderness areas, as did Israel Keys. But what about the voices? The warnings? How would children know about this unless something or someone was telling them? Children are perceptive in ways adults often aren't," Joanna said. "They pick up on subtleties, on atmosphere. If there is someone dangerous operating in that forest, maybe they sensed something adults would rationalize away." I wasn't entirely convinced, but Joanna's perspective offered a framework for action. "So what do we do?" "We?" She raised an eyebrow. "I'm involved in this, Joanna. I've witnessed it firsthand, twice. I can't just walk away." She studied me for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, I'll make some inquiries, look into those missing persons cases more thoroughly. I'll also see about organizing a search of the area Isabel pointed toward. But," she held up a warning finger, "this needs to be done properly, through official channels. No amateur sleuthing, understood?" I agreed, though with some reservation. Official investigations moved slowly, and I couldn't shake the feeling that time was somehow important. Nevertheless, I provided Joanna with all the information I had gathered, including the approximate location where Isabel had indicated the cave might be found. For the next week, I waited anxiously for news. I called Joanna daily, receiving brief updates that amounted to bureaucratic delays and procedural hurdles. She had initiated a formal review of the missing persons cases connected to Greenvale, but assembling a search team required justification, resources, and approvals. Meanwhile, I continued my own research, careful to avoid any actual visits to Greenvale. I found more historical references to disappearances in the area, dating back to the early 1900s. Most intriguing was an interview with an elderly Abenaki man from 1972, archived in a university's anthropology department. He spoke of a place in the forest where the Hungry One lived, an entity that was neither human nor spirit, but something in between. According to the account, this being lured people into a hidden dwelling, never to be seen again. 10 days after our meeting, Joanna called. "We're going in tomorrow," she said without preamble. "I've been approved for a small search team, ostensibly to look for evidence related to the 1997 disappearance. but really to check out this area you and Isabel identified. I'm coming with you, I said immediately. Absolutely not. This is an official operation. Joanna, I know that area better than most of your officers. I've been camping there for years, and I've seen both children who received warnings. I might notice things others would miss. There was a long silence. You'll stay with me at all times, she finally said, and you'll follow every instruction without question. Clear? Clear, I agreed, relief washing through me. I needed to see this through, to confirm or disprove what I had begun to suspect, that something ancient and malevolent dwelled in Greenvale Forest, and had been preying on visitors for generations. The next morning dawned overcast and cool, the sky a uniform gray that threatened rain. I met Joanna and 3 other officers at the Greenvale Forest Ranger Station. They were dressed in tactical gear, wearing utility belts with firearms, radios, and other equipment. I felt conspicuously civilian in my hiking clothes and backpack. The team leader, Sergeant Weber, briefed us on the operation. We would hike to the approximate location identified in my research, conduct a thorough search of the area, and document any findings. If we discovered anything requiring forensic investigation, we would secure the site and call for additional resources. As we set out, following a little-used maintenance trail, I found myself scanning the forest constantly, alert for any unusual sounds or movements. But the woods seemed ordinary in daylight, peaceful, even beautiful, with no hint of the eerie quality I had experienced during nighttime hours. After about 40 minutes of hiking, we left the trail using GPS coordinates to navigate toward the area Isabel had indicated. The terrain became increasingly difficult. Dense underbrush, fallen trees, and slippery slopes requiring careful navigation. The forest here was older, the trees larger and more widely spaced, with a thick canopy that created a perpetual twilight beneath. As we progressed, I noticed the officers growing tense, their hands drifting more frequently to their weapons. They were experienced professionals trained to detect threats, and something about this section of forest was triggering their instincts. You feel it too, don't you? I murmured to Joanna, who walked beside me. She nodded almost imperceptibly. Something's not right here. The acoustics, maybe. Sounds don't carry normally. She was correct. Despite 5 people moving through underbrush, our sounds seemed muffled, contained within a small radius around each of us. Even our voices didn't project as they should have. We reached a small clearing dominated by a massive oak tree, its trunk gnarled and twisted with age. The officers spread out in a search pattern, methodically examining the surrounding area. I stayed near the oak, studying its unusual shape. The trunk split near the ground, creating a natural archway partially obscured by ferns and moss. Joanna, I called softly. Look at this. She approached, crouching beside me to examine the opening. Could be an animal den, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. I pointed to marks on the inner surface of the arch, linear grooves that couldn't have been created by natural processes. Those looked like tool marks. Joanna activated her radio, calling the other officers to our position. As they gathered, she directed her flashlight into the opening. The beam illuminated a narrow passage extending downward at a steep angle. The walls gleamed damp and reddish in the light. Iron oxide deposits, one of the officers commented. Gives it that red color. The red cave. We had found it. Sergeant Weber made a quick decision. Peters, radio for backup and forensics. Tell them we've found a potential site of interest. He turned to Joanna and another officer. We'll conduct an initial assessment, document the entrance, and secure the perimeter. No one goes inside until backup arrives. I should have been relieved. We had found what we came for, and professionals would handle the investigation from here. But something felt unfinished, urgent. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no insects. Not even the whisper of wind through leaves. While the officers busied themselves with equipment and radio calls, I found myself drawn to the oak tree. Placing my palm against its rough bark, I closed my eyes, feeling oddly compelled to establish some kind of connection. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, so faintly I might have imagined it, I heard whispering, not in my ears, but directly in my mind. Fragmented phrases, urgent warnings. Beware. Still here, hungry, must see, must understand, show them, evidence. I opened my eyes, disoriented. The voices, if they were voices and not my imagination, seemed to be urging me toward the cave entrance. urging me to look, to witness, to gather evidence before it was too late. I glanced at the officers. They were preoccupied with establishing a perimeter, their attention directed outward. The cave entrance gaped before me, unguarded for this brief moment. What I did next was reckless, potentially dangerous, and definitely against my promise to Joanna. I dropped to my hands and knees and crawled into the opening. The passage was narrow but navigable, descending at a steep angle into darkness. The walls were indeed reddish, slick with moisture, and marked with those strange linear grooves that became more numerous as I progressed. My small tactical flashlight provided limited illumination, but enough to avoid obstacles. After approximately 20 feet, the passage widened into a small chamber. The air was stale, carrying a musty metallic odor that made me gag slightly. My flashlight beam caught reflective surfaces along the walls, objects embedded in the reddish clay. I moved closer, directing the light more precisely, and felt my heart stutter. Bones. Human bones protruding from the walls. And not just bones, personal effects. A wristwatch, a torn backpack, a child's shoe. Horror rising in my throat, I swept the light around the chamber. The remains appeared to be arranged in a deliberate pattern, not simply buried or discarded. Some were partially exposed, others barely visible beneath the surface of the clay. Most disturbing were the scratch marks, hundreds of them covering every surface, as though the victims had tried desperately to claw their way out. As my light reached the far side of the chamber, it illuminated something that didn't belong with the older remains, something recent. A small notebook with a familiar cover. I recognized it immediately as the nature journal we had distributed to the Girl Scouts on our most recent trip. Opening it with trembling hands, I found Isabel's name printed carefully on the first page. But Isabel hadn't disappeared. She had returned safely with us. How had her notebook ended up here? Unless this was what the voices had wanted me to find. Evidence. Proof. A sound behind me. Scraping, like something heavy being dragged across stone. I whirled, directing my flashlight toward the passage I had entered through. A shadow moved within the tunnel, larger than a human should have been in that confined space, flowing like liquid darkness. Panic seized me. I pressed myself against the chamber wall, searching desperately for another exit, but found none. The scratches on the walls took on new significance, the futile efforts of those who had found themselves trapped just as I was now. The shadow continued to advance, now accompanied by a low, wet sound that might have been breathing. My flashlight beam seemed to pass through it rather than illuminate it, revealing only glimpses of a form that refused to resolve into anything recognizable. In that moment of absolute terror, with death seemingly inevitable, the whispering returned, louder now, almost deafening in its intensity. Not yours, protected. Go back. The shadow hesitated, then recoiled as though struck. The whispering continued, words in languages I didn't recognize joining the chorus, rising to a crescendo that seemed to make the very air vibrate. The shadow retreated further, writhing in apparent distress. I remained frozen, unsure if I was witnessing a conflict between opposing supernatural forces or experiencing a stress-induced hallucination. The shadow receded completely, and the whispering subsided to a gentle murmur. Go, now. Tell. Stop him. I didn't need further prompting. Clutching Isabel's notebook, I scrambled back into the passage, crawling frantically toward the entrance. Behind me, the shadow seemed to gather itself for another advance. But the whispering surged again, holding it at bay. I emerged from the cave entrance gasping, immediately confronted by Joanna and Sergeant Weber, their expressions a mixture of anger and concern. What the hell were you thinking? Joanna demanded, gripping my arm painfully. Evidence? I gasped, holding out the notebook. Isabel's. And bodies. There are bodies in there. Dozens of them. Weber grabbed the notebook, examining it with narrowed eyes. How is this possible? The girl is safe at home. I don't know, I admitted. But it's proof. Something is happening here, something that's been happening for decades. Before they could respond, a low rumbling sound emanated from the cave entrance. The ground beneath us trembled slightly and a cloud of dust billowed from the opening. When it cleared, the entrance had collapsed, sealed by fallen earth and rocks. Sergeant Weber immediately ordered everyone back, concerned about further collapses. As we retreated to a safe distance, I described what I had seen inside the cave. The remains, the personal effects, the scratch marks. Joanna took notes, her expression growing grimmer with each detail. "And you're saying something was in there with you?" she asked. "Something alive?" I hesitated. How could I describe what I had seen, what I had felt, without sounding delusional? I'm not sure alive is the right word. But yes, there was a presence, and something else. The voices, the whispering. They protected me. "Voices," Weber repeated flatly. "The same ones that warned Cindy and Isabel," I insisted. "They're trying to stop whatever is happening here." "They've been trying for years." Joanna and Weber exchanged looks, and I recognized the skepticism in their expressions. But they had Isabel's notebook, tangible evidence that something inexplicable had occurred. And once they excavated the collapsed cave entrance, they would find the remains, confirming at least part of my account. We hiked back to the ranger station in silence, my mind racing. I had glimpsed something beyond normal understanding. A predator that had hunted in Greenvale for generations, and entities of some kind that opposed it. I had been allowed to see, to gather evidence, because they needed human help to end the cycle of disappearances. At the ranger station, Weber initiated protocols for a major crime scene investigation. Additional personnel were called in, including forensic experts and equipment for excavation. I provided a formal statement, carefully recounting what I had observed inside the cave, while omitting the more supernatural elements that would undermine my credibility. As night fell, Joanna drove me home, both of us quiet and contemplative. Before I exited her car, she turned to me with a serious expression. "I don't know what's happening in that forest," she said. "And I'm not sure I want to know. But we'll investigate thoroughly, I promise you that." I nodded, grateful for her commitment. "The voices," I said hesitantly. "They've been trying to warn people for years. Children like Cindy and Isabel could hear them when adults couldn't. Maybe they finally found someone who would listen." Joanna didn't respond directly, but her expression softened slightly. "Get some rest. I'll call you when we know more." I watched her drive away, then entered my empty apartment. Sleep would be impossible, I knew. My mind was too full of red caves and whispering trees and shadowy predators. But for the first time since I had returned from Greenvale, I felt a measure of peace. Whatever had been happening in that forest for generations, it would happen no more. The evidence would be found, the remains identified, the families given closure, and perhaps, in some way I couldn't fully comprehend, the voices would finally rest, their long vigil ended. 6 months have passed since that day in Greenvale Forest. The investigation continues, proceeding with the meticulous pace of all major forensic operations. The cave entrance was excavated 3 weeks after our discovery, revealing exactly what I had described, a chamber containing human remains spanning decades. 23 sets of remains have been recovered so far, with forensic anthropologists working to identify each victim. DNA analysis has already confirmed connections to several of the historical disappearances, including the 13-year-old boy from 1983 and the 9-year-old girl from 1997. Isabel's notebook remains unexplained, a temporal anomaly that scientists prefer to attribute to someone planting it rather than accept more supernatural explanations. As for what, or who was responsible for the deaths, the investigation has focused on a former park ranger named Joseph Whitmore, who worked at Greenvale from 1978 to 2001. Records show he lived in an isolated cabin near the area where we found the cave. After his retirement, he disappeared, supposedly moving to Arizona, but no records of his existence can be found after 2001. Investigators are pursuing the theory that Whitmore was a serial killer who used his knowledge of the forest to abduct and murder visitors, then concealed their remains in the cave. It's a tidy explanation, fitting the evidence while avoiding uncomfortable questions about whispering forests and shadowy entities. I've accepted it publicly, nodding along during briefings and interviews, providing details that support the narrative. But privately, I know there was something more in that forest, something older and more malevolent than a human killer, something that had hunted long before Joseph Whitmore arrived and might have continued hunting long after he departed. I believe that Whitmore may have been influenced by this entity, perhaps possessed by it, becoming its instrument in the physical world. And I believe that the forest itself, or spirits within it, had been trying to end the killings for generations, using the only means available, reaching out to minds open enough to hear them, trying to guide someone to the evidence that would expose the truth. I haven't returned to Greenvale Forest. The area around the cave remains cordoned off as an active crime scene, and my presence would only complicate the investigation. But sometimes, on quiet nights, when the wind moves through the trees outside my window, I think I hear whispering, faint, almost imperceptible, but carrying a sense of gratitude. I've continued my work with the Girl Scouts, finding healing in guiding young women through experiences that build confidence and resilience. I've become particularly attentive to the quiet ones, the dreamers who stare into the distance as though listening to voices others can't hear. They're the sensitive ones, the ones who might sense truths hidden from the rest of us. Cindy graduated high school this year. She has no memory of her strange experience in the forest, or at least claims not to. Isabel has become more outgoing since our camping trip, showing an interest in nature and conservation that her parents attribute to her Girl Scout activities. Neither girl knows about the investigation, the cave, or the recovered remains. I hope they never need to. As for me, I've developed a more nuanced relationship with fear. I no longer see it as something to be avoided, but as a warning system that sometimes detects threats beyond our rational understanding. The forest taught me that there are thin places in the world where different realities brush against each other, places where ancient forces still move, still communicate with those willing to listen. I don't speak of this publicly. The official explanation satisfies the authorities and comforts the families of the victims. A human killer, no matter how monstrous, is comprehensible in a way that older, stranger threats are not. We can analyze his methods, understand his motivations, ultimately reduce him to something manageable within our worldview. But I know what I experienced in that red cave. I know what saved me when death seemed certain. And I know that when I walk through forests now, I listen more carefully to the whispers among the trees, attentive to warnings that might come from places beyond ordinary understanding. Some nights, I dream of that massive oak tree with its twisted trunk and natural archway. In the dreams, I place my hand against its bark and feel the slow, steady pulse of something ancient and watchful. And I hear words clear as spoken language. Thank you. For listening, for seeing, for stopping. I always wake from these dreams with a profound sense of peace, knowing that sometimes the most important role we can play is simply to bear witness, to acknowledge truths others cannot or will not see, and to act on that knowledge with courage and conviction. The Red Cave is sealed now, its secrets exposed to light after decades of darkness. Whatever hunted in Greenvale Forest hunts no more. But the whispers continue, carried on the wind, reminding us that we are never truly alone in this world, that eyes watch and voices speak from the liminal spaces between what we know and what we sense. And sometimes, if we listen carefully enough, they guide us toward truths that might otherwise remain hidden forever. I've always found peace in isolation, not the kind that breeds loneliness, but the liberating sort that frees you from the constant pressure of social performance. Roger understood this about me from our first date 3 years ago, a quiet picnic in an empty corner of Marshall Park, rather than the bustling restaurant he'd initially suggested. This shared appreciation for solitude formed the bedrock of our relationship. By April 2023, we had established a tradition of monthly escapes. As two self-proclaimed introverts with demanding office jobs in Seattle, these getaways weren't luxury. They were necessity. Our apartment walls seemed to close in after weeks of conference calls and artificial office lighting. We craved open spaces where we could breathe without constraint. "I need trees," Roger would say whenever work stress built to unbearable levels. "I need silence." And I would pack our gear without question. What distinguished our trips from typical vacations was our deliberate avoidance of crowds. While most hikers and campers gravitated toward established trails and designated campgrounds, we sought the overlooked corners of wilderness areas. We didn't break rules or trespass, but we studied maps meticulously to find legal yet secluded spots where encounters with other humans would be minimal. Our friends often question this preference. Isn't it safer to camp where there are other people? They'd ask. What about wild animals? Cell reception? These concerns always amused us. The statistical likelihood of animal attacks was minimal compared to the guaranteed irritation of noisy neighboring campers. As for safety in numbers, Roger and I trusted each other more than strangers. We carried satellite communication devices for emergencies, but relished being temporarily unreachable. The worst things I've encountered in forests have always been human, I would respond, not realizing the prophetic nature of those words. In retrospect, perhaps our confidence bordered on arrogance. We had completed dozens of remote hikes without incident, building an exaggerated sense of security. This confidence led us to that steep trail in the Olympic National Forest, the one Roger's coworker mentioned casually during lunch break. It's brutal but worth it, he'd told Roger, and hardly anyone knows about it. You might not see another soul all day. Those words were exactly what we wanted to hear. We arrived at the trailhead shortly after dawn on a crisp Friday morning in late April. The parking area was little more than a widened shoulder beside a logging road, unmarked except for a weathered wooden sign partially hidden by overgrowth. Perfect. I climbed out of our Subaru and stretched, breathing deeply. The air carried the sharp scent of pine and wet earth, a welcome change from city pollution. Birdsong replaced the constant urban hum, and morning mist hung between trees like gossamer curtains. This place is exactly what we needed, I said, already feeling the knots in my shoulders loosening. Roger nodded while unloading our packs. According to the topographic map, there's a flat area about 3 miles up that would make a good campsite. It's near a stream tributary, so we'll have water access. Our plan was straightforward. Establish camp at this midpoint, continue hiking to the summit that afternoon, then enjoy a full day of exploration tomorrow before descending on Sunday. The forecast promised clear weather, though spring in the Olympics was notoriously unpredictable. We secured our packs, mine considerably lighter than Roger's despite my protests, and began the ascent. The trail immediately lived up to its reputation for steepness. Within 20 minutes, my calves burned and my breathing grew labored. Your coworker wasn't exaggerating about this grade, I called to Roger, who hiked several yards ahead. He glanced back with a grin. Good training for that Mount Baker trip we've been talking about. The trail alternated between dense forest sections and occasional clearings that offered glimpses of the valley below. With each hour, the ecosystem subtly changed. Ferns gave way to hardier undergrowth. The mixed forest thinned into predominantly coniferous trees that stood like columns supporting the sky. By noon, we had covered approximately 2 miles and gained considerable elevation. We paused for lunch on a rocky outcrop, sharing a thermos of coffee and sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. The trail seems less maintained from here, Roger observed, studying the path ahead. More overgrown. That's probably why fewer people venture this far. I nodded, enjoying the solitude. I haven't seen a single footprint besides ours all morning. After lunch, we continued upward. The trail narrowed and occasionally disappeared altogether, forcing us to navigate by landmarks and compass bearings. This was precisely the adventure we craved, challenging yet achievable with our experience level. Around 2 o'clock, we reached the flat area Roger had identified. A small clearing surrounded by western hemlocks offered protection from wind, with a bubbling stream just 50 yards away, ideal for our needs. We established our campsite efficiently, having perfected our system over numerous trips. The large 4-season tent went up quickly, followed by our portable cooking station. We secured our food in bear-resistant containers hung from a tree branch at a safe distance. Should we rest before continuing to the summit? Roger asked, noting my flushed face and heavy breathing. Absolutely not, I replied with determination. We've come this far. Let's reach the top before sunset. Leaving most of our gear secured at camp, we continued upward with lighter packs containing only water, snacks, first aid supplies, and extra layers. The afternoon sun filtered through the canopy, creating dappled patterns on the forest floor. This higher section of trail grew increasingly technical, requiring careful footing on loose rocks and exposed roots. It was during this final ascent that our solitude was unexpectedly broken. I first noticed their voices before seeing them, A man and woman engaged in animated conversation around a switchback ahead. The sounds carried clearly in the otherwise silent forest, startling me after hours without human contact. Roger turned to meet my gaze, his expression mirroring my disappointment. Our private wilderness experience was suddenly compromised. When we rounded the corner, we encountered them, a couple appearing to be in their early 30s, equipped with high-end hiking gear that looked suspiciously pristine. The woman had copper-colored hair pulled into a neat ponytail, while the man stood tall with broad shoulders and a meticulously trimmed beard. Both smiled with perfect teeth when they spotted us. "Hello there," the woman called with apparent delight. "We thought we were the only ones crazy enough to tackle this trail today." Roger nodded politely but maintained distance. "Same here. Didn't expect to run into anyone." I remained slightly behind Roger, my social anxiety immediately flaring. Extended conversations with strangers always felt like navigating a minefield, exhausting and fraught with potential missteps. "I'm Victor," the man said, extending his hand first to Roger, then to me. His grip lingered uncomfortably on mine. "And this is Jennifer. We're from Portland, just up for the weekend." "Roger," my boyfriend responded with a nod. "And this is Kira," I interjected, using my middle name rather than my first, a habit when meeting strangers in isolated settings. Jennifer stepped forward. "Such a pleasure. We've hiked all through Oregon but decided to explore Washington this season. This trail is quite the challenge, isn't it?" Their friendliness seemed excessive, but not immediately alarming. Perhaps they were simply extroverts starved for interaction after hours on a deserted trail. Still, something about their interest felt performative rather than genuine. "Have you reached the summit yet?" Roger asked, maintaining the conversation while I observed. Victor shook his head. "No, we're on our way up now. According to our GPS, it's about another mile. The views are supposed to be spectacular." "We're heading there too," I said, speaking up despite my discomfort, "though we've established camp at the flat area below." "Smart move," Jennifer remarked. "We were planning to complete the entire hike today, but it's taking longer than expected. We might end up camping at the summit." Victor's eyes brightened. "Hey, why don't we continue together? Safety in numbers, right? These remote trails can be unpredictable." I wanted to decline immediately, but social conditioning made me hesitate. Roger glanced at me, silently communicating that this was my decision to make. He knew how much I valued our isolation. "Sure," I finally agreed, figuring we could always create distance later if needed. "We can hike together for a while." The four of us resumed the ascent, with Victor and Jennifer immediately dominating conversation. They asked questions about our lives, where we worked, how long we'd been together, our hiking experience, while offering similar information about themselves. Victor claimed to work in investment banking, while Jennifer described herself as a freelance photographer specializing in nature shots. Their stories sounded rehearsed, lacking the natural inconsistencies of truthful narratives. They never disagreed or interrupted each other, and their anecdotes wrapped up too neatly. I noticed Roger's increasing tension in the set of his shoulders as he provided vague answers to their probing questions. About 30 minutes into our joint hike, I began lagging behind, genuinely fatigued from the steep climb. Roger stayed with Jennifer ahead while Victor fell back to join me. "Tough trail, huh?" he commented, his voice dropping to a more intimate register. "You're handling it well, though. I can tell you're experienced." "Thanks," I replied curtly, focusing on my footing rather than conversation. Victor moved closer, his shoulder occasionally brushing mine despite the trail being wide enough for separation. "You have excellent muscle definition in your arms. What's your workout regimen?" "Jennifer's been trying to tone up her gluteal muscles but struggles with consistency." His comment about my physique sent warning signals flaring when his hand reached out to touch my forearm. Ostensibly to examine my definition, I instinctively pulled away. "I do basic strength training," I responded coldly, increasing my pace to create distance. "Nothing special." Victor seemed undeterred by my obvious discomfort. "Well, it's certainly effective. Your boyfriend must appreciate your fitness." I quickened my steps further, catching up to Roger and Jennifer. To my dismay, Roger's expression had darkened considerably. When I reached his side, he immediately created an excuse to pause. "Let's take a water break," he suggested, pulling me slightly aside while Victor rejoined Jennifer. Under the pretense of sharing a water bottle, Roger whispered, "We need to turn back. She just made extremely inappropriate comments about my body and suggested exploring more than just the trail together." My stomach tightened. Victor did the same, touching my arm and commenting on my physique. Roger's jaw clenched as he surveyed our surroundings. We had climbed high enough that dense forest had given way to more exposed terrain with scattered trees and rock formations. The summit was visible ahead, perhaps half a mile further. "Let's tell them we're turning back," Roger decided. "Make an excuse about checking our campsite before dark." I nodded in agreement, relieved to have an exit strategy. We approached Victor and Jennifer with forced smiles. Roger explained that we wanted to return to camp before dark to secure our equipment, thanking them for the company but declining to continue to the summit. "That's a shame," Jennifer pouted, her expression momentarily hardening before softening again. "We were enjoying getting to know you. Perhaps we'll see you on the descent tomorrow," Victor suggested, his tone conveying disappointment that seemed disproportionate to our brief acquaintance. We exchanged awkward goodbyes and began our descent, maintaining conversation volume until we rounded a bend that took us out of their sight. Only then did we exhale collectively. "That was deeply unsettling," I whispered, still uncertain whether my discomfort was justified or exaggerated by my social anxiety. Roger reached for my hand. "Trust your instincts." Their behavior crossed several boundaries. We descended quickly, hyper-aware of sounds behind us, though no footsteps followed. The beautiful forest that had seemed welcoming hours earlier now felt ominous, with shadows stretching longer as afternoon progressed toward evening. "Do you think they might follow us?" I asked, voicing my growing concern. Roger considered this. "It's possible, but unlikely. They expressed interest in reaching the summit, and daylight is limited. They'd need to descend in darkness if they delayed much longer." His logical assessment calmed me somewhat, though unease lingered like a persistent shadow. We reached our campsite as golden hour began, the angled sunlight transforming the forest into a fiery tableau that would typically inspire awe. Today, it only emphasized our isolation. Roger immediately checked the perimeter of our campsite while I verified our supplies. Everything appeared undisturbed. Our tent stood exactly as we'd left it, and our hanging food cache remained secure. We prepared dinner on our portable stove, the familiar routine providing comfort after the unsettling encounter. As we ate freeze-dried pasta beneath the darkening sky, our conversation inevitably returned to Victor and Jennifer. Something felt rehearsed about them, I observed. "Like actors playing roles rather than genuine hikers." Roger nodded. Their gear was too new, not a scuff or dirt smudge anywhere. "And did you notice they carried minimal water for supposedly planning a full-day hike?" I hadn't registered this detail, but Roger's observation heightened my unease. Every experienced hiker knows water is the non-negotiable essential, especially on strenuous trails. After washing our cookware in the nearby stream, I reached for my bracelet, a silver band my grandmother had given me years ago that I always touched for reassurance. My wrist was bare. "My bracelet is gone," I announced, panic rising. "And my ring, too." The simple silver ring had been a gift from Roger on our first anniversary. I searched frantically through my pack, emptying contents onto our ground sheet while Roger assisted. Neither item appeared. "I never removed them," I insisted, growing increasingly distressed. "They couldn't have fallen off accidentally." Roger's expression darkened with realization. "Victor touched your arm and hand on the trail when he was commenting on your definition. Could he have removed them without you noticing?" The suggestion initially seemed implausible. How could someone remove jewelry without detection? But recalling the deliberately distracting conversation and physical contact, I recognized the possibility. That would explain why he was so insistent on touching me, I concluded, anger replacing confusion. It was misdirection, making me uncomfortable to distract from what his hands were actually doing. Roger rubbed his face, frustration evident. "I'll hike back up tomorrow morning to look for them. They might have dropped them if they only wanted to create distress rather than steal valuables." This plan seemed reasonable, though spending another night knowing the strange couple might be nearby left me deeply unsettled. We secured everything carefully and retreated to our tent earlier than usual. Exhaustion from the day's physical exertion and emotional stress claiming us quickly. I've never considered myself particularly fearful during camping trips. The typical concerns, wildlife encounters, extreme weather, navigation errors, seemed manageable with proper preparation. That night, however, introduced me to a more profound dread, the awareness of malevolent human presence in what should be unthreatening wilderness. We prepared for sleep with extra precautions, positioning our hiking poles and cooking utensils within easy reach. Roger placed his heavy tactical flashlight beside his sleeping bag, a potential improvised weapon if needed. These measures felt simultaneously prudent and absurd. Were we overreacting to a merely uncomfortable social encounter? "Do you think we should leave tonight?" I whispered as we settled into our sleeping bags, the forest now completely dark around our small illuminated tent. Roger considered this seriously. Hiking down in darkness would be dangerous, even with headlamps. The trail has too many hazardous sections. We're safer waiting until morning. His assessment was correct, but provided little comfort. I drifted into uneasy sleep sometime after midnight, dreams fractured with images of pursuing figures and landscapes that shifted unpredictably beneath my feet. The sound that woke me was subtle, a single snapping branch that might have gone unnoticed if my sleep hadn't been so shallow. I lay motionless, straining to hear past the pounding of my heart. Then came another sound, hushed whispers just beyond our tent wall. I reached for Roger, my fingers finding his arm. He was already awake, his body tense beside mine. When our eyes met in the darkness, he pressed a finger to his lips, then pointed toward the tent entrance. Moving with deliberate slowness, Roger unzipped the tent just enough to peer outside. The sudden movement of his body as he pushed the opening wider and called out startled me. "Hey, what are you doing over there?" His voice carried authority despite our vulnerable position. I couldn't see the response from my position, but I heard Jennifer's voice, artificially bright even at this late hour. "Oh, thank goodness you're awake. We saw a bear near the summit trail and followed your campfire smoke to warn whoever might be camping here. These woods aren't safe tonight." Their explanation might have seemed plausible if we'd actually had a campfire, which we hadn't. The strict fire regulations in this drought-prone area and our commitment to low-impact camping meant we never lit open flames. Roger maintained conversational tone while subtly reaching for his flashlight. "Appreciate the warning. We're all set here, though. Did you manage to make camp up at the summit?" "No, conditions weren't suitable," Victor's voice replied. "We're making our way down now. Better to hike in darkness than risk wildlife encounters." Roger nodded. "Safe travels, then." He ducked back inside, zipping the tent closed. Rather than speaking, he kept his eyes fixed on the tent window, his body completely still. His finger remained pressed against his lips in the universal signal for silence. For 5 excruciating minutes, we remained motionless, listening intently. Only when Roger finally relaxed slightly did he lean toward me, his mouth directly beside my ear as he whispered, "Pack everything essential as quietly as possible. We're leaving immediately." "What did you see?" I mouthed silently. Victor had a hunting knife in his hand and another holstered at his belt. They weren't carrying overnight packs or bear spray. "There's no bear. They came specifically for us." Terror washed through me like ice water. My hands trembled as I stuffed essentials into my backpack. Water, energy bars, first aid kit, extra layers. Roger disassembled our sleeping arrangements with remarkable efficiency, compressing items into stuff sacks without regard for proper packing. "Leave anything non-essential," he murmured. "Speed matters more than completeness." Within 10 minutes, we had gathered critical supplies and clothing. Roger peered out periodically, using different vantage points to survey our surroundings. During one check, he signaled that the coast appeared clear, and we emerged from the tent. Rather than properly dismantling it, Roger simply collapsed the structure and stuffed the fabric and poles haphazardly into its carrier. The process created more noise than ideal, but speed outweighed stealth at this point. We moved toward our vehicle with deliberate steps, attempting to minimize sound while maintaining haste. Every snapping twig beneath our boots sent jolts of adrenaline through my system. The forest that had seemed peaceful during daylight had transformed into a labyrinth of potential hiding places and ambush points. Halfway to the trailhead, Roger froze, gripping my arm to halt my progress. Ahead in the darkness, a beam of light swept across the trail, a flashlight moving in an erratic pattern that suggested searching rather than straightforward hiking. Off trail, Roger mouthed, pulling me into the undergrowth. We crouched behind a fallen log, breathing shallowly as the light approached. Through gaps in the vegetation, I glimpsed Victor's silhouette, his posture tense and predatory. He passed our position without detecting us, continuing down the trail toward our former campsite. "Circle around," Roger whispered once Victor was safely past. "They've split up to search." This realization accelerated my heart rate further. Jennifer must be somewhere nearby, potentially between us and the trailhead. We abandoned the trail entirely, navigating by compass, bearing through dense forest. Progress slowed considerably as we negotiated fallen trees. Dense undergrowth and uncertain footing, but remaining undetected outweighed all other considerations. After what seemed like hours but was likely only 40 minutes, we glimpsed the clearing where we'd parked. No flashlights or movement were visible. Roger insisted on observing for 5 full minutes before approaching the vehicle, scanning methodically for any sign of tampering or ambush. When we finally reached the Subaru, Roger checked underneath with his flashlight before unlocking it. We threw our hastily packed gear into the back and entered quickly. Only when the engine started and headlights illuminated the empty forest road did I release the breath I'd been holding. "We made it," I whispered, too mentally exhausted to fully process our escape. Roger's knuckles remained white on the steering wheel. "They'll hear the engine. We need to put distance between us quickly." He navigated the winding forest road with greater speed than safety warranted, but each mile increased our security. Only after we reached the main highway did Roger's posture relax marginally. "What were they planning?" I finally asked, the question that had burned in my mind since discovering Victor's concealed weapons. Roger shook his head. "Nothing good. Best case, robbery. Worst case..." He didn't complete the sentence. We drove through the night, stopping only for fuel at a brightly lit gas station where surveillance cameras provided reassurance. By dawn, we had reached our apartment building in Seattle, the familiar surroundings offering little comfort given our shattered sense of security. After collapsing into exhausted sleep for several hours, we awakened to process the events more rationally. My missing jewelry seemed insignificant compared to our potential fate had we remained at the campsite. "We should report this to authorities." Roger suggested over coffee that felt inadequate to combat our exhaustion. I agreed, though skepticism about actionable outcomes tempered my expectations. What could we report beyond an uncomfortable encounter and suspicions? We had no evidence of criminal intent beyond Roger's observation of Victor's knives, something many hikers carried legitimately. Nevertheless, we filed a report with both local police and forest rangers, providing descriptions and approximate location details. The officer who took our statement seemed sympathetic but realistic about limited jurisdiction in remote wilderness areas. "We'll pass this along to rangers and neighboring counties," he promised. If these individuals matched descriptions from other incidents, that could establish a pattern. This response provided minimal reassurance but fulfilled our civic responsibility. With the report filed, I channeled restless energy into research, starting with the names Victor and Jennifer had provided. Social media searches yielded several matching profiles from the Portland area, though none featured photos resembling our trail encounters. I expanded the search parameters to include news articles, which delivered the most disturbing revelation yet. "Roger," I called from my laptop, voice strained. "Look at this." He read over my shoulder as I displayed a 3-year-old news article about a hiking accident in the Cascade Mountains. The deceased couple, Victor and Jennifer Westlake, had fallen from a cliff face during adverse weather conditions. The article included their photograph, a smiling couple in their 30s who bore no resemblance to the individuals we'd encountered. "They used dead people's names," Roger whispered, the implication chilling us both. "Why would anyone do that unless they had something to hide?" The question multiplied our unease exponentially. This detail transformed our experience from potentially unfortunate misunderstanding to confirmed predatory behavior. People with legitimate intentions don't assume identities of the deceased. I expanded my research to similar incidents in Pacific Northwest wilderness areas, discovering several reports of hikers experiencing theft or harassment in locations matching our criteria: remote trails, minimal traffic, substantial distance from assistance. There's a pattern, I concluded after hours of research. Isolated hikers targeted by seemingly friendly couples who establish contact, separate their marks, then create opportunities for theft or worse. Roger had contacted his coworker who recommended the trail, learning that he'd never actually hiked it himself but had heard about it from another acquaintance. Information distorted through multiple retellings. This explained the trail's poor maintenance. It wasn't popular among legitimate hikers. I think they may use these obscure trails as hunting grounds, Roger suggested grimly. Places where they're unlikely to encounter multiple groups who might later compare notes or provide corroborating witness statements. The theory aligned disturbingly well with our experience. We'd been selected precisely because of our isolation, our preference for solitude transforming from source of joy to vulnerability. The weeks following our narrow escape brought sleepless nights and jumpiness that affected daily functioning. Ordinary sounds, a neighbor's door closing, branches scraping windows during windy nights, triggered disproportionate startle responses. My previously manageable social anxiety expanded beyond reasonable boundaries, making workplace interactions increasingly difficult. Roger suggested therapy, recognizing signs of post-traumatic stress that exceeded normal processing of frightening events. Initially resistant, I eventually agreed after a panic attack in a crowded elevator left me gasping for breath and fighting tears. Dr. Hadley specialized in trauma response and outdoor misadventures, an unexpectedly specific combination that provided immediate credibility. During our initial session, she listened without judgment as I recounted our experience. "What you're describing is a normal neurological response to genuine threat," she explained after I detailed my hypervigilance and sleep disturbances. "Your brain's alarm system functioned exactly as designed during your encounter, and now it's remaining inappropriately activated." This framing, that my reactions weren't weakness, but appropriate biological responses, provided unexpected relief. She outlined treatment approaches combining cognitive behavioral techniques with gradual exposure therapy, emphasizing that recovery wouldn't require abandoning outdoor activities permanently. "The goal isn't to never hike again," Dr. Hadley clarified. "It's to reclaim your enjoyment of activities that previously brought fulfillment, with appropriate safety modifications." These safety modifications became our focus during subsequent weeks. Roger and I researched personal security measures for remote hiking, satellite communication devices, location sharing protocols, self-defense options compatible with leave-no-trace principles. We enrolled in wilderness first aid courses that addressed not only physical injuries, but psychological responses to threatening situations. Gradually, we ventured outdoors again, initially in heavily trafficked nature preserves where ranger stations and fellow hikers provided security through visibility. Each successful outing incrementally rebuilt confidence, though certain triggers remained problematic. The sound of branches breaking still elicited immediate physiological responses, regardless of context. 2 months after the incident, forest rangers contacted us regarding our report. A couple matching our description of Victor and Jennifer had been arrested after attempting similar tactics with a group of hikers in Olympic National Park. Unlike us, their intended victims had been prepared with personal defense training and equipment. More significantly, this group maintained separation and documented the encounter with discreet photography. Several items recovered from their vehicle matched descriptions of stolen property reported by other hikers throughout Washington and Oregon, the ranger explained. "Your report helped establish the pattern that justified expanded investigation." This development provided validation but incomplete closure. Though arrested for theft and possession of stolen property, charges related to more serious intentions remained speculative without conclusive evidence. The couple refused to provide their actual identities, their fingerprints matching no records in law enforcement databases. "They're ghosts," Roger observed after we received this update. "People who've deliberately erased their past to operate outside accountability systems." This realization reinforced our new approach to wilderness experiences, balancing appreciation for solitude with recognition of inherent vulnerabilities. We continued hiking but modified our habits significantly. providing detailed itineraries to trusted contacts, establishing regular check-in protocols, researching trails through official sources rather than word-of-mouth recommendations. 1 year after our encounter, Roger proposed a significant challenge, returning to Olympic National Forest for a day hike in a different section than our previous experience. The suggestion triggered immediate anxiety, but also recognition of its importance for psychological recovery. "We don't have to decide immediately," he assured me, "but eventually, reclaiming this specific forest feels important, not letting them take it from us permanently." Dr. Hadley supported this approach as an appropriate culmination to months of gradual exposure therapy, provided we established comprehensive safety protocols. We selected a moderate trail with regular ranger patrols and documented usage, scheduled during peak season, rather than seeking isolation. "The goal isn't replicating our previous preference for solitude," Roger explained as we planned the trip. "It's creating new positive associations with these forests specifically." On a clear Saturday in May 2024, we returned to Olympic National Forest with significantly different mindsets than our previous visit. Rather than seeking escape from humanity, we welcomed the presence of other hiking groups we encountered, each representing potential assistance rather than intrusion. The forest remained objectively beautiful, towering conifers creating cathedral-like spaces, wildflowers emerging in sunny clearings, birdsong providing nature's soundtrack. Initially, I experienced these surroundings through the filter of hypervigilance, scanning constantly for threats rather than beauty. Gradually, however, intentional mindfulness practices allowed me to separate present reality from traumatic memory. The scent of pine needles warmed by sunshine began registering as pleasant rather than threatening. The sound of distant hikers' conversations became reassuring rather than anxiety-inducing. At the summit viewpoint, surrounded by several other hiking groups enjoying the panoramic vista, Roger reached for my hand. "You did it," he said simply. I nodded, acknowledging the significance beyond completing a physical trail. We both did. The wilderness that had temporarily become a source of terror had begun its transformation back to sanctuary. My stolen jewelry remained gone, material losses never recovered despite the arrests. But something more valuable had been reclaimed: agency in relationship to natural spaces. That evening, sharing a meal with fellow hikers at a designated campground rather than isolated backcountry site, I reflected on our journey beyond physical terrain. The couple who targeted us had exploited our desire for isolation, transforming our strength into vulnerability. Our revised approach acknowledged human interconnectedness as potential protection rather than intrusion. I still prefer quieter trails, I admitted to Roger as we watched sunset colors transform distant mountains. "But I've gained appreciation for the security of community." He nodded in understanding. Balance rather than extremes. The forest around us deepened toward darkness, but unlike our previous experience, nearby campfires and voices created a perimeter of human presence that felt protective rather than intrusive. We would continue seeking wilderness experiences, but with modified awareness that danger sometimes wears a friendly human face rather than wild animal features. Some nights, I still wake to phantom sounds of breaking branches, momentarily disoriented between past trauma and present safety. These episodes have diminished in frequency and intensity, however, transitioning from debilitating terror to manageable startle responses. When asked if I would return to remote trails eventually, my answer remains open-ended. The wilderness offers irreplaceable restoration, but extraction from human support networks carries risks that must be acknowledged rather than dismissed. Our future adventures will balance solitude with safety, isolation with connection, adventure with awareness. The most terrifying revelation remains unresolved: how many others might have encountered similar predators without escaping to share their stories? This question underlies my commitment to sharing our experience despite the vulnerability of disclosure. The wilderness deserves respect not only for its natural hazards but for its potential to conceal human threats among its shadows. Roger and I ended our romantic relationship 6 months ago, though we maintain friendship and occasional hiking partnership. Our shared trauma created bonds that remain valuable despite relationship evolution. We both carry forward lessons from our encounter: vigilance tempered with openness, caution balanced with continued exploration. The forest still calls to me, its invitation complex rather than purely comforting. I answer selectively, with preparation rather than naivety, respecting both its majesty and its capacity to harbor darkness. True wilderness appreciation requires acknowledging all facets of its reality, beauty and danger inextricably interwoven like roots beneath a forest floor. I remember when the hills of Pembrokeshire meant nothing but peace to me. Now they're stained with memories I can't erase, tainted by questions I can't answer. My name is Bronwyn Hughes, and I've worked as a critical care nurse at Withybush General Hospital for nearly 8 years. The irregular hours and emotional toll of my profession have always been balanced by the calm I found hiking the majestic Welsh countryside with my border collie. Arth, whose name means bear in Welsh, was anything but fearful. He confronted the world with a boundless enthusiasm that made even my darkest days brighter. We'd adopted each other 4 years ago when I found him abandoned outside the hospital, trembling and malnourished. The veterinarian estimated he was around 2 years old then, making him a sturdy 6-year-old companion now. Or at least he was before that day on Carnangley. My shifts at the hospital often stretched to 14 hours, sometimes longer during emergency situations. The nature of critical care meant I frequently returned home physically exhausted and emotionally drained, having witnessed suffering that most people would struggle to comprehend. This particular week in early May had been especially difficult. We'd lost 2 patients, one elderly man to heart failure and a teenage girl to complications from a car accident. The girl reminded me of my younger sister with the same delicate features and determined spirit. I'd fought alongside the medical team for hours to stabilize her, but her injuries proved too severe. By Monday, I was operating on minimal sleep and maximal stress. My mother, Gwen, had been looking after Arth during my weekend shift. She lived about 20 minutes away in Haverfordwest, and often helped when my schedule became particularly demanding. When she arrived with Arth that Monday afternoon, his excited barking and tail wagging seemed to inject life back into my weary bones. "You look terrible." "Cariad," my mother said as she handed me his leash using the Welsh term of endearment. "Are you sure you don't want to rest before taking him out?" I shook my head, scratching behind Arth's ears as he pressed his body against my legs. "I've been cooped up for days, ma'am. We both need fresh air." She pursed her lips in that way that meant she disagreed but wouldn't press the issue. "At least have some tea before you go gallivanting off." We sat in my small kitchen, steam rising from our cups as she updated me on local gossip and her Women's Institute meetings. All the while, Arth paced impatiently by the door, occasionally returning to rest his head on my lap with pleading eyes. All right, I finally conceded, draining the last of my tea. "We're going now." My mother hugged me tightly before leaving. "Don't stay out too late. The weather report mentioned possible rain tonight." I promised we wouldn't, never imagining that rain would be the least of my concerns. The drive to Carnangley took about 40 minutes from my cottage in Pembroke. As we wound through narrow country lanes, Arth sat in the passenger seat, his head out the window, tongue lolling in the breeze. The clock on my dashboard read 7:36 p.m. when we pulled into the small gravel car park at the base of the hill. Carnangley isn't the highest point in the Preseli Hills, but it's one of the most distinctive. Ancient standing stones mark the remains of an Iron Age fort near its summit, and local legends claim it as a place where Saint Brynach communed with angels in the 6th century. The tourist brochures describe it as mystical and atmospheric, but to locals like me, it was simply a beautiful walking spot with spectacular views of the Irish Sea. I'd visited Carnangley countless times, in all seasons and weather conditions. I knew its paths intimately. The way the main trail forked about halfway up, with the left path leading to the standing stones, and the right winding through a small woodland before emerging near the summit. I knew which sections became muddy after rain and where the best views could be found. Or at least, I thought I knew it. As I gathered our supplies, water bottle, small first aid kit, granola bars, and Arth's favorite tennis ball, I noticed the car park was empty. This wasn't unusual for a Monday evening, especially since most tourists visited during weekends or holiday periods. The isolation never bothered me before. In fact, I preferred having the trails to ourselves. The evening sun hung relatively high, promising at least 2 hours of good light before sunset. May in Wales offers generous daylight, with darkness not fully settling until almost 10 p.m. I had my phone with its built-in torch for the return journey, and the trail was well marked. There was no reason to feel apprehensive as we set off up the gentle slope that marked the beginning of our hike. Yet something felt different this time. The usual sounds of birds seemed muted, the rustling of leaves somehow ominous rather than soothing. I dismissed these impressions as the result of my fatigue and recent emotional strain at work. The scientific part of my brain understood that perception is easily influenced by one's physical and mental state. "Come on, Arth," I called cheerfully, forcing enthusiasm into my voice. "Time for our mega walk." He bounded ahead, stopping occasionally to sniff interesting patches of grass or investigate rabbit holes. His joyful exploration temporarily pushed away my unease, and I followed him up the path, unaware that we were being watched. The initial ascent was pleasant enough. Spring had coaxed an array of wildflowers from the hillside. Clusters of bluebells carpeted the woodland edges, while yellow gorse brightened the more exposed areas. The exertion of climbing gradually loosened the knots of tension in my shoulders, and my breathing fell into a steady rhythm that matched my footsteps. Arth zigzagged ahead, occasionally disappearing from view before reappearing with twigs or interesting stones in his mouth, presenting them to me like treasures. His unbridled joy was infectious, and I found myself smiling for what felt like the first time in days. About halfway up, we paused at a natural platform that offered views across the rolling countryside. Farms appeared as patchwork quilts of green and gold, separated by ancient stone walls and hedgerows. In the distance, the afternoon sun glinted off the Irish Sea, a sliver of silver beneath the vast sky. I uncapped my water bottle, pouring some into a collapsible bowl for Arth before taking a long drink myself. The water was cool against my throat, and I closed my eyes momentarily, savoring the sensation and the whisper of breeze against my skin. When I opened them again, I noticed dark clouds gathering on the western horizon. They were still distant but moving steadily inland. My mother's warning about rain crossed my mind, but I calculated we had plenty of time to reach the summit and begin our descent before any weather arrived. "What do you think, boy?" I asked Arth, who was now sniffing intently at a clump of heather. "Should we continue to the top?" He looked at me with those intelligent brown eyes, then turned to gaze up the path as if considering the question. After a moment, he barked once and wagged his tail. "I'll take that as a yes," I laughed. Repacking our water, we took the right fork in the path, entering the small woodland that flanked the eastern side of Carn Angli. The trees here weren't particularly ancient or large, mostly oak, ash, and hawthorn that had established themselves over the past century or so. But they grew close together, their branches creating a canopy that dappled the afternoon light into shifting patterns on the earth. The path narrowed here, forcing us to walk single file. Arth led the way, occasionally stopping to investigate animal trails that branched off into the undergrowth. The woodland had always been my favorite part of the hike, a secret green world that felt separate from ordinary existence. Today, however, the shadows seemed deeper, the silence more pronounced. No birds called from the branches overhead, no insects buzzed in the undergrowth. Even the wind seemed to have died, leaving the leaves unnaturally still. "Probably going to rain," I murmured to myself, trying to explain away the peculiar atmosphere. Weather changes often affect animal behavior, I reasoned. They were simply seeking shelter before the approaching storm. As we neared the edge of the woodland, where the path would emerge onto the more exposed upper slopes, Arth suddenly stopped. His body became rigid, ears pricked forward, tail motionless. I halted behind him, watching as he tilted his head slightly, as if listening to something beyond human hearing. "What is it, boy?" I whispered, feeling the first real stirring of unease. He didn't respond, remaining frozen in place for several long seconds, before abruptly relaxing and continuing forward. I followed, telling myself it was probably a rabbit or fox he'd sensed. Yet the incident left me feeling strangely vulnerable, aware of our isolation in a way I hadn't been before. We emerged from the woodland onto the upper slopes, where the path grew steeper as it approached the summit. The standing stones of the ancient fort were visible now, dark silhouettes against the increasingly dramatic sky. The clouds I'd spotted earlier had drawn closer, transforming the western horizon into a wall of deepening gray. "Just to the top, and then we'll head back," I promised Arth, who had resumed his enthusiastic exploration of the hillside. If only I'd turned back then. If only I'd heeded the warnings. The unnatural silence, Arth's momentary alertness, the gathering storm. But I continued upward, drawn by familiar routine and the promise of that magnificent summit view, unaware that something waited for us among the ancient stones. We reached the summit just as the first distant rumble of thunder rolled across the hills. The standing stones, weathered by countless centuries, stood like ancient guardians around the flattened area that had once been the center of the Iron Age fort. From here, the view was truly spectacular, a panorama of Pembrokeshire stretching to the horizon, with the darkening sea to the west and the patchwork of fields and villages to the east. Under normal circumstances, I would have lingered, perhaps sitting on one of the fallen stones to absorb the tranquility and vastness of the landscape, but the approaching storm and the lateness of the hour urged caution. The sun now hung low, partially obscured by the advancing clouds, casting long shadows across the hilltop. "Let's head back." "Arth," I called, turning toward the path. He stood about 20 meters away, near the edge of the summit plateau, his attention focused intently on something I couldn't see. His posture was alert, but not alarmed, curious rather than fearful. "Arth," I called again, more firmly. This time he glanced back at me before returning his gaze to whatever had caught his interest. I sighed, crossing the uneven ground toward him. As I drew closer, I noticed he was looking down the northern slope of the hill, a steeper, more rugged descent than the path we'd climbed. Scattered gorse bushes and occasional boulders dotted this side, creating numerous shadows and hiding places. I peered in the same direction, seeing nothing unusual. "What are you looking at, boy?" "There's nothing there." But even as I said it, I felt a strange certainty that I was wrong. There was something there, something watching us from the gathering shadows. The skin at the back of my neck tightened, and I found myself scanning the slope with increasing urgency. A movement caught my eye, just a flicker at the edge of my vision, gone when I tried to focus on it. Perhaps it was a shadow shifting as clouds passed overhead, or vegetation moving in the strengthening wind. But it left me with an overwhelming sense that we were not alone on the hilltop. "Come on," I said, clipping Arth's lead to his collar. "Time to go." He resisted momentarily, still fixated on the northern slope, before reluctantly allowing me to lead him back toward our ascent path. The wind had picked up significantly, bringing with it the scent of imminent rain. Another rumble of thunder, closer now, emphasized the urgency of our descent. We began retracing our steps, moving more quickly than during our climb. Arth seemed to have forgotten whatever had captured his attention, trotting alongside me with no sign of distress. I, however, couldn't shake the feeling of being observed. Several times I turned to look behind us, seeing nothing but the emptying hilltop and darkening sky. The first fat raindrops began to fall as we re-entered the woodland. The canopy provided some shelter, but water still dripped through, pattering against the leaves and earth. The premature darkness beneath the trees made the path harder to follow, and I found myself moving more cautiously, aware of roots and stones that could easily cause a fall. Halfway through the woodland, Arth suddenly stiffened beside me. A low growl built in his throat, not his usual alert bark when spotting wildlife, but something deeper, more primal. The hair along his spine stood erect, and his tail tucked slightly between his legs. I froze, straining my senses against the gathering gloom. Rain tapped against leaves, wind sighed through branches, and beneath these natural sounds, something else, a rustling movement that seemed deliberate rather than random. "Hello?" I called, my voice sounding thin and uncertain. "Is someone there?" No response came, yet the sensation of being watched intensified. I fumbled for my phone, activating its torch function. The beam cut through the dimness, illuminating rain-slicked trunks and dripping foliage. I swept it in a slow arc, seeking reassurance in the mundane details of the woodland. The light caught nothing unusual, yet Arth's growl deepened. His body trembled against my leg, communicating fear more eloquently than words ever could. I had never seen him react this way, not to other dogs, not to strangers. not even during thunderstorms that typically frightened animals. "It's okay," I whispered, trying to convince myself as much as him. "Let's keep moving." We proceeded more quickly now, Arth pressing close against my side. The rain intensified, drumming against the canopy above. Water began running down my face, soaking into my jacket. The path grew slippery underfoot, forcing me to divide my attention between watching for hazards and scanning our surroundings. As we neared the edge of the woodland, where the path would emerge onto the more open lower slopes, Arth abruptly stopped. His growl transformed into a whimper, and he pressed himself against my legs so forcefully I nearly lost my balance. "What is it?" I demanded, directing my torch beam ahead. The light revealed nothing but rain-swept vegetation and the continuation of our path. Yet something had terrified my dog. Something he could sense but I could not perceive. That's when I heard it. A sound that didn't belong to the storm or the woodland. A soft, deliberate scraping, like claws against bark. It came from somewhere to our right, among the densest part of the undergrowth. And then, fleetingly illuminated as my torch beam swept past, 2 points of reflected light, like eyes catching the glow. They vanished immediately, so quickly I couldn't be certain I'd seen them at all. But Arth had no such doubts. His whimper became a yelp of pure terror, and he pulled desperately at his lead, trying to retreat back up the path we'd just descended. "No, Arth," I hissed, tugging him forward. "We need to get out of here." The woodland exit lay just 30 meters ahead. Beyond it, the more open terrain would offer better visibility, and I hoped safety from whatever lurked among the trees. I urged Arth forward, practically dragging him despite his resistance. We burst from the woodland onto the open slope, rain lashing against us without the barrier of the canopy. The car park was visible in the distance below, a reassuring destination. Arth no longer resisted our forward progress, now seeming as eager as I was to leave the hill behind. As we hurried down the slippery path, I cast one final glance back toward the woodland edge. In the deepening twilight amplified by the storm clouds, I could distinguish little detail. Yet for an instant, I thought I saw a shape detach itself from the shadows, something low to the ground but substantial, moving with deliberate purpose. I didn't wait to confirm the sighting. Clutching Arth's lead, I half ran, half slid down the remainder of the path, pursued by the intensifying storm and something far more terrifying than mere weather. We were about halfway down the lower slope when it happened, the moment that would haunt my dreams for months to come. The rain had eased slightly, though the wind continued to howl around us. Darkness had almost completely enveloped the landscape, with only the faintest glow of twilight remaining on the western horizon. My phone torch provided our only reliable illumination, casting a narrow beam that barely seemed to penetrate the gloom. Arth padded beside me, no longer pulling, but still clearly anxious to reach the safety of the car. His fur was soaked, his usually proud tail held low. A hedge bordered this section of the path, an ancient boundary marking the edge of what had once been farmland. Thick hawthorn and blackthorn created an impenetrable barrier alongside us, further narrowing our route of escape. Without warning, Arth erupted into frenzied barking. Not his usual alert bark, but something desperate and terrified. He lunged toward the hedge, straining against his lead with such force that the fabric cut into my palm. "Arth, stop!" I commanded, but he was beyond listening. His barks grew increasingly hysterical as he pulled toward whatever had triggered his reaction. I couldn't see anything beyond the dense tangle of thorny branches, just darkness and the occasional movement of leaves in the wind. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, Arth's barking ceased. A tremor passed through his body, visible even in the dim light. He backed away from the hedge, pressing himself against my legs. A whimper escaped him, a sound of such absolute terror that it sent ice through my veins. I directed my torch toward the hedge, seeing nothing but dripping foliage. Yet Arth continued to retreat, nearly tripping me in his desperation to put distance between himself and whatever lurked beyond. "What is it?" I whispered, scanning the hedge line. That's when I heard it, a sound unlike anything I'd encountered before. Not quite a growl, not quite a hiss, but something that combined elements of both. It emanated from just beyond the hedge, perhaps 2 meters away. The sound was low, almost subsonic, more felt than heard. Arth collapsed against my legs, trembling violently. To my horror, I realized he was urinating involuntarily, something I'd never seen him do before. Pure terror had overridden every aspect of his training and natural behavior. I swept my torch along the hedge again, desperate for visual confirmation of what threatened us. The beam caught something, a disturbance in the vegetation, branches moving against the wind. Something substantial was pushing through from the other side. Reason told me to identify the threat, to know what we faced. But instinct, more powerful than logic, screamed for immediate flight. I grabbed Arth's lead and tugged, trying to break his paralysis of fear. "Come on!" I shouted, no longer concerned about attracting attention. He remained frozen, whining pitifully, his eyes fixed on the hedge. I bent down, awkwardly lifting all 25 kilograms of him. His body was rigid with terror, but he didn't resist being carried. With Arth in my arms, I turned and ran. The path was treacherous with mud and rain, the descent steep enough to make each step precarious. But fear drove me forward, overriding caution. My torch beam bounced wildly, creating disorienting flashes of illuminated ground and vegetation against surrounding darkness. Behind us, the strange sound came again, louder now, and somehow conveying deliberate pursuit. Something crashed through the hedge, twigs breaking and leaves rustling. I didn't look back, focusing every fiber of my being on reaching the car park below. Arth trembled against my chest, his whimpers continuous now. The weight of his sodden body strained my already exhausted muscles, but adrenaline kept me moving. My breathing came in harsh gasps, visible as vapor in the cold night air. The path widened as we neared the bottom, becoming less steep. I risked increasing my pace, aware that the sounds of pursuit had grown fainter. Were we outpacing the threat, or had it simply become more stealthy in its tracking? Finally, the gravel surface of the car park appeared in my torch beam. My vehicle stood alone in the darkness, its familiar shape the most welcome sight I could imagine. I fumbled with the key fob, pressing the unlock button repeatedly until the lights flashed and the locks clicked open. Opening the rear door one-handed while holding Arth was nearly impossible, but fear granted extraordinary coordination. I practically threw him onto the back seat before slamming the door and rushing to the driver's side. Once inside, I locked all doors immediately, gasping for breath as rain plastered my hair to my face. Arth huddled on the back seat, still trembling violently, his eyes wide and unfocused. I turned the key in the ignition, relief flooding through me as the engine roared to life. Headlights illuminated the empty car park and the beginning of the path we'd just descended. Rain slanted through the beams, creating shifting curtains of light and shadow. And there, at the edge of the illumination, something moved. Just for an instant, a dark shape, low and powerful, withdrawing from the light with deliberate purpose. It was gone before I could process details, melting into the darkness beyond the headlight's reach. I threw the car into reverse, tires spinning on wet gravel before finding purchase. The vehicle lurched backward, then forward as I changed gear and accelerated toward the access road. Arth whimpered from the back seat as we bounced over potholes. But I couldn't slow down, not until we were far from Carnangley and whatever had hunted us on its slopes. The journey home passed in a blur of rain-slicked roads and tension. I drove mechanically, hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles whitened, eyes constantly checking the rearview mirror, despite the logical impossibility of being followed. Arth remained in an unprecedented state of distress. Usually an enthusiastic car passenger, he now lay curled into a tight ball on the back seat, occasionally emitting soft whimpers that tore at my heart. His wet fur soaked into the upholstery, but such concerns seemed trivial compared to his psychological state. By the time we reached my cottage, the rain had diminished to a gentle patter. I parked as close to the door as possible, still irrationally fearful of the short distance between car and house. Arth refused to move from the back seat, forcing me to lift him again and carry him inside. Once in the cottage, I moved through my usual routines with mechanical precision, turning on lights, securing doors and windows, drawing curtains against the night. These ordinary actions provided a semblance of normality, a framework to contain the chaos of emotion threatening to overwhelm me. I placed Arth on his bed near the radiator and examined him thoroughly. Medical training temporarily overriding emotional distress. No physical injuries were apparent, no cuts, no thorn scratches, no signs of contact with whatever had frightened him. yet his behavior remained deeply disturbing. He refused food and water, curling into a tight ball with his nose tucked beneath his tail. After showering and changing into dry clothes, I made tea and sat beside him on the floor, attempting to process what had happened. My rational mind sought explanations that would fit within my understanding of the world. A wild animal seemed the most logical conclusion, perhaps a fox or badger emerging from its den. But neither explanation fully accounted for Arth's extreme reaction. He had encountered wildlife before without showing fear. Furthermore, badgers and foxes typically avoided human contact rather than appearing to pursue it. Sleep eluded me that night. I lay in bed listening to the diminishing rain and Arth's occasional distressed sounds from his bed beside mine. When exhaustion finally pulled me under, my dreams were fragmented and unsettling, shapeless threats pursuing me through darkened woods, and always that strange sound echoing behind me. Morning brought temporary relief. Sunlight streamed through gaps in the curtains, transforming my bedroom into a space that seemed incapable of harboring fear. Arth appeared somewhat recovered, accepting water and a small amount of food, though still unusually subdued. I called in sick to work, unable to face the prospect of leaving him alone after such trauma. Then I began researching, seeking information that might explain our experience on Carn Angley. My investigation began with local wildlife. Pembrokeshire hosts badgers, foxes, otters, and various deer species, none of which typically present threats to humans or domestic dogs. I searched news reports for unusual animal sightings in the area, finding nothing recent or relevant. Then I broadened my search, typing large predators whales into the search engine. The results were immediately more interesting and disturbing. I discovered numerous reports of big cat sightings across Wales stretching back decades. Most described panther-like creatures, with some accounts mentioning pumas or lynxes. A 2013 article detailed a woman's claim of being chased by a wolf in North Wales. More recently, a news piece from January this year reported puma sightings and people hearing roars while walking dogs at night. The explanation seemed plausible. Exotic pets released into the wild when they grew too large to manage, subsequently breeding and establishing territories in the remote Welsh countryside. The scientific part of my mind acknowledged that such populations could potentially survive undetected in areas of low human habitation. Yet something about this explanation felt incomplete. The behavior I'd witnessed, the deliberate stalking, the sounds unlike any felid I'd ever heard described, didn't align perfectly with big cat behavior as I understood it. After exhausting online resources, I turned to local knowledge. The following day, feeling slightly more composed and with Arth showing signs of recovery, I drove to the village library in Crymek, the nearest settlement to Carn Angley. The librarian, an elderly woman named Mrs. Priest who had worked there for decades, listened to a sanitized version of my experience with unexpected seriousness. "You're not the first to come asking about strange happenings on Carn Angley," she said, leading me to a section of local history books. The hill has a reputation going back centuries. She selected a slim volume titled Folklore of the Preseli Hills and opened it to a chapter on Carn Angley. The text described various legends associated with the location, including St. Brynach's angelic communications. "But here's what might interest you," Mrs. Priest said, pointing to a paragraph near the end of the chapter. The passage described local beliefs from the 18th and 19th centuries that Carn Angley hosted a guardian beast that protected the ancient fort site. According to tradition, this creature remained invisible most of the time but would reveal itself to those who visited the hill with ill intent or at inauspicious times. "Nonsense. Of course," Mrs. Priest said, though her expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced of this. "But people around here still avoid the hill after dark. They say animals sense it more easily than humans do." I left the library with more questions than answers, torn between rational explanations and the disturbing resonance of the folklore with my experience. Perhaps the legend had developed precisely because a population of exotic big cats had established themselves in the area generations ago. Yet this explanation still didn't fully account for the profound terror Arth had displayed, a reaction far beyond normal animal fear. Dogs might be cautious around predators, but his complete breakdown suggested something more unsettling. In the days that followed, I researched big cat behavior extensively, learning that they typically avoided humans rather than pursuing them. I joined online forums where people shared similar experiences throughout Wales and broader Britain, finding some comfort in the knowledge that I wasn't alone in my encounter. A week after the incident, with Arth gradually returning to his normal behavior, I visited my veterinarian friend Rhiannon, seeking her professional perspective. Animals perceive things differently than we do, she explained after hearing my account. Their senses are more acute, particularly scent and hearing. What terrified Arth might have been something you couldn't detect at all. A big cat? I suggested. She considered this, tapping her pen against her desk. Possibly, but dogs typically respond to predators with defensive aggression rather than complete terror, especially when their humans are present. What else could cause such extreme fear? Rhiannon hesitated. I'm a scientist, so I should give you a scientific answer. But my grandmother would say that animals sometimes perceive things beyond our understanding, things that exist at the edges of our world. I left her office unsettled by this uncharacteristically mystical statement from my pragmatic friend, yet her words echoed something I'd been reluctantly considering, that perhaps the explanation lay beyond conventional understanding. 2 weeks after our encounter on Carn Angley, life had largely returned to normal. Arth showed no lasting trauma, resuming his enthusiastic exploration of our regular walking routes, though I carefully avoided anything near the Preseli Hills. Work absorbed my attention, providing welcome distraction from unanswered questions. Yet beneath this semblance of normality, something had fundamentally changed. I found myself more alert to my surroundings, particularly when outdoors at dusk. Strange sounds caused immediate tension, and darkness no longer seemed merely an absence of light, but something potentially harboring unseen presence. I'd almost convinced myself that the incident had a rational explanation. A big cat, perhaps, or even a massive feral dog, when an unexpected encounter challenged this comfortable assumption. I was shopping in Haverfordwest when I encountered Mrs. Priest from the library. After exchanging pleasantries, she mentioned that another walker had reported a frightening experience on Carn Angley just days after my visit. A man from Newport, she explained, walking his Labrador in the early evening, said the dog went berserk near the woodland edge, same reaction you described. He was sensible enough to leave immediately. Did he see anything? I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Mrs. Priest glanced around before lowering her voice. He claims he glimpsed something moving among the trees. Said it was large and dark, but moved like nothing he'd ever seen before. Not quite like a mammal. Said it seemed to flow rather than run. A cold sensation spread through my chest. Did he report it? To who? The police would think he was mad, and wildlife authorities would dismiss it without evidence. She adjusted her shopping bag. People around here know better than to make official reports. We just warn each other. I thanked her for the information and completed my shopping mechanically, mind racing with implications. Another witness, another terrified dog. The pattern strengthened both the reality of the threat and its mysterious nature. That evening, I found myself searching online for scientific explanations of supposedly supernatural phenomena. Perhaps there were atmospheric or geological conditions on Carn Angley that created infrasound, sound waves below human hearing that could trigger fear responses in both animals and people, or maybe some unusual electromagnetic phenomenon that animals could perceive but humans could not. These explanations felt like stretching, attempts to force extraordinary experience into ordinary frameworks. Yet the alternative, accepting that something existed beyond current scientific understanding, challenged my fundamental worldview as a medical professional. 1 month after the incident, I made a decision that surprised even me. I would return to Carn Angley, alone this time in daylight, to confront both the location and my fears. The morning was bright and clear as I parked in the now familiar car park. Other vehicles were present, a retired couple preparing for a walk, a family with young children organizing their backpacks. The normality was reassuring. I chose a different route than before, taking the left fork that led directly to the standing stones rather than through the woodland. The climb was physically demanding, but emotionally easier in full daylight, surrounded by occasional fellow hikers. At the summit, I found the stone circle occupied by a tour group, their guide explaining the archaeological significance of the site. I lingered at the periphery, listening to the rationale, historical narrative that made no mention of beasts or guardians. When the group departed, I approached the largest standing stone, a weathered monolith nearly 3 meters tall. Placing my hand against its rough surface, I tried to connect with the countless generations who had visited this place before me, many of whom must have crafted explanations for their own unexplained experiences. As I stood there, a sudden breeze swept across the summit carrying an unexpected scent, musty and animal, yet unlike any domestic or common wild species I recognized. My body tensed involuntarily, senses heightening as they had that night. I turned slowly, scanning the open hilltop. Nothing unusual was visible, just grassland, scattered rocks, and the clear paths leading in various directions. Yet the sensation of being observed returned with overwhelming intensity. My gaze was drawn to the edge of the woodland we'd passed through that night. From this elevation I could see its full extent, a dark green irregularity against the smoother contours of the hillside. Something moved at its periphery, a shadow detaching briefly from deeper shadows before melting back into obscurity. Rational explanation insisted it was merely vegetation moving in the wind, or perhaps a deer seeking shelter. But deeper instinct recognized it as something else, something that didn't belong entirely to the world as I understood it. I didn't flee this time. Standing my ground, I stared toward the woodland edge until the sensation of being watched gradually subsided. Whatever presence had acknowledged me seemed to have withdrawn, perhaps respecting this deliberate, daylight encounter differently than our previous nighttime intrusion. On the descent, I reached a resolution of sorts. I would likely never fully understand what hunted the slopes of Carnangley. Scientific explanations felt insufficient, yet I couldn't entirely embrace supernatural ones either. Perhaps some questions weren't meant to be answered conclusively. Perhaps the boundaries between known and unknown, natural and supernatural, were not as clearly defined as modern thinking suggested. Our ancestors had lived with this ambiguity, acknowledging forces beyond their understanding without needing to categorize them definitively. I could learn to do the same, to accept mystery without surrendering critical thinking, to acknowledge inexplicable experiences without abandoning rational frameworks that served well in most circumstances. Arth and I still take our mega walks regularly, exploring the beautiful Pembrokeshire landscape that remains largely benign and welcoming. But we stay away from Carnangley, especially as daylight wanes. Some boundaries are best respected, some territories best left unchallenged. And on dark nights when wind moves through the trees around my cottage, I sometimes detect that strange sound again, not quite growl, not quite hiss, carried on the breeze from the direction of the Preseli Hills. I close my curtains tighter then, and Arth presses closer against my leg, both of us acknowledging wordlessly that something watches and waits on Carnangley, something that will likely remain nameless and unexplained. Perhaps that's as it should be. In a world increasingly mapped, measured, and explained, there is perhaps value in these persistent mysteries, these reminders that our understanding remains incomplete, that wonder and terror still inhabit the wild edges of our world, challenging our certainties and reminding us of older truths we have too readily dismissed.